next speaker has been mentioned by two speakers already, Mordechai Nisan. He's an Israeli professor, scholar of Middle East studies. He's been at the Hebrew U, I think, for 30 years, and the author of Only Israel West of the River. And I might add, this is heavily influenced by Canada. Both Jeffrey and Mordechai and myself came from Canada. So there you are. Go ahead, Mordechai.
Thank you very much, Ted. And thank you very much to Mudal and to everybody who's attending the conference. I have a very specific topic that I want to lay out in hopefully a very structured fashion. And I'll leave it to the audience to draw whatever conclusions they choose to draw. I'm interested here in Israeli policy towards Jordan. And even though that policy has been ensconced in brick for decades, it's something which requires some kind of re-examination. Israel's policy towards Jordan for decades, for really 100 years prior to Israel's founding and Jordan's founding, but going back to the predecessors in that role, has been to engage the Jordanians / Hashemites / East Bankers in a positive relationship, believing that Israel's interest lies in cultivating that relationship. Today, what is the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, of course. And that therefore Jordan is an Israeli asset, an Israeli interest, which should be sustained as far as Israel's capabilities extend. That's the Israeli policy. And I want to now substantiate that policy, and then I want to question that policy. And in the end, we'll see what kind of conclusions I may draw or other people may draw. So first, to give you 4 reasons why it's in Israel's interest that the Jordanian kingdom in its present political constitutional format survives. And if some of these things seem a little astray to the ears of some of our listeners, let's all be very tolerant and patient, and we'll go through this together. The first reason to suggest that Jordan is an Israeli interest is that Jordan has sustained a stable regime for many decades. In the Middle East, which has descended into chaos, in particular what is facetiously called the Arab Spring of 2011, Jordan has maintained its political stability. It hasn't gone the way of Libya, the way of Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Egypt, but rather the regime, the monarchical regime, the dynastic regime of the Hashemites, has preserved its power. And there has not been any major revolt / revolution, coup d'etat. Rather, the regime is stable. So if Israel wants to maintain a good relationship with a stable Arab country, Jordan is obviously a good choice. The record of Palestinian behavior in a number of countries where they have lived and taken part in some kind of political action, the Palestinian record is very, very negative. They created chaos in Lebanon. They're at war with Israel for decades. They challenged the Hashemite regime in Jordan on different occasions. They basically took the opposite stand to Kuwait, where they were enjoying their host country's hospitality. And the PA in Judea and Samaria is a corrupt rogue regime. And the Hamas regime in Gaza is, as we know, an Islamicist terrorist regime. So if we compare the stability of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan with the record of Palestinian behavior in other countries and places, Israel is gone with the stable regime of Jordan. A second reason why Jordan is an Israeli asset, and Israel has been cultivating that relationship for 100 years, as they say, is that there has been a kind of romantic utilitarian benefit for Israel in dealing with the Hashemites from day one, back in 1921. Ted mentioned the Weitzman-Faisal meeting and agreement from 1919. And through the decades of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and so on, there's a constant dialogue going on between the Zionists and the Hashemites. And it acquired various expressions and examples. It's very interesting and fascinating. from an Israeli architect who helped build the palace of King Abdallah or Emir Abdallah, to medical assistants and teachers and the like. So the connection between the Hashemites and the Zionists, I'm talking about prior to 1948, was, if not intense, consistent over decades. In the 1948 war, there was some kind of tacit understanding between the emerging Jewish state of Israel and the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. Tacit understanding in terms of the war, areas of fighting, modes of fighting. It's not foolproof, it's not all white instead of black, but definitely there was tacit understanding about the division of the territory for the common objective for Israel and Jordan, which was to deny, if possible, the establishment of an independent Arab state west of the river. And that is exactly what happened. No Arab state / Palestinian state emerged, which was the policy objective of both Israel and Jordan. And the cooperation over the years between the two countries continued in various ways, often defined by the expression, the Jordanian option. When we use the expression, the Jordanian option, it can be misleading. It can mean Jordan is the state of Palestine or is Palestinian state to be, or the Jordanian option can mean there'll be some kind of agreement, partial agreement between Israel and Jordan regarding some functional relations in Judea and Samaria. But the idea of discussing what becomes known as the Jordanian option from an Israeli point of view was to come to some kind of practical agreement or understanding with the Hashemites in terms of the conduct of affairs in Judea and Samaria and Gaza. This until Jordan disengaged from the West Bank in an official fashion in 1988. So we have here the historical relationship, which was based to a degree on trust and cooperation. A third reason for Israel to sustain the relationship is that Jordan, in effect, constitutes a buffer state for Israel looking eastward. East is, to a degree, northeast is Syria, of course, Iraq, east, Iran, east, ISIS, Daesh, if you like, east. And the role of Jordan is that its very existence, which lacks history, which lacks nationhood, which lacks a compelling idea or spirit, but the function of Jordan is that its very existence and its political geographic contours is such that for Israel, it is a buffer state to hopefully, with Israel's assistance, obviously, deny any Arab attack from the east, again, ISIS, Iraq, Iran, Syria, from penetrating through Jordan and then threatening Israel directly across the Jordan River westward in Israel proper. So Jordan as a buffer state has a role to play in Israel's strategic thinking. And then there are tactical aspects to the relationship, security-related tactical aspects, which touch on the idea of Jordan as a buffer state. For example, we're well familiar with Israel contributing, we won't go into it, Israel contributing to Jordan's security in the disintegration of political affairs in the Middle East in 1958, in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and so on. Israel played a role there in terms of forging Jordan's ability to sustain its well-being in the midst of chaos around her. There's the role of Israel in 1970 in what becomes known as Black September for the Palestinians. It wasn't Black September for King Hussein, of course. And there Israel played a role in trying to deter a Syrian attack against Amman by mobilizing its forces and the like, and being ready to use its air force against Syria if Jordan would need that in order to preserve its existence. And on the other hand, Jordan contributing to Israel, the example of 1973 is fascinating. It is then that prior to the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War on October 6, 1973, we know that King Hussein actually warned Prime Minister Golda Meir of an imminent Syrian-Egyptian assault against Israel. He actually warned Israel, which tells us that for Jordan, Israel's existence is a national imperative. That if Israel were Khalila to fall, then Jordan would be probably swallowed up by a stronger Arab neighbor, Syria, Iraq, or maybe even Saudi Arabia. That being the case, so Israel contributed in certain ways to Jordan's welfare, 1958, 1970, and Jordan contributed to Israel's welfare, the example of 1973. And when Jordan actually did not go to war with Egypt and Syria against Israel, it did contribute a military force to the Syrian front, but it was almost like a symbolic way whereby Jordan would not be accused of having stood on the sidelines while the Arabs were fighting against the Zionists. A fourth reason why Jordan is in Israeli interest, it could be suggested, is that both Israel and Jordan hover under the American umbrella. They're both considered to be, if not aligned, if not allies of the United States, aligned with the United States. King Abdullah recently in Washington, maybe he's still there in the United States, was referred to by President Biden as an ally. Jordan is an ally of the United States, use that terminology. So the idea that both Israel and Jordan are supported by the United States economically, in particular militarily, of course, militarily, intelligence, American troops on the ground in Jordan, Israel benefiting from American military assistance, economic assistance. So they both fall into the same category of allies that are aligned with the United States, and therefore Israel working with Jordan, accommodating Jordan, seeing in Jordan a positive element on the map of the Middle East, fits in with America's strategy in the Middle East, looking at both Israel and Jordan as stable countries in a sea of chaos. Now that I said that, and why therefore there is substance to Israel choosing to look at Jordan as a positive element in Israel's national interest, now the other side of the equation, that Jordan is not of value to Israel. The first reason is really the centerpiece of this conference, that Jordan is not part of the Palestinian equation, in fact, in political reality. The narrative is, as we all know, people promoting incessantly, obsessively, the two-state solution to the Palestinian question, whereby those two states are west of the river, Israel is constituted, and a Palestinian state in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. That's the two-state solution. Jordan is not part of the equation. Jordan is not considered by the international community, nor by Israel, as playing a role in the resolution, quote unquote, of the so-called Palestinian problem, which means the Palestinian problem will not be solved at Jordan's expense, but at Israel's expense, despite the fact, as has been mentioned, that Jordan has a majority Palestinian population. It's historically in what we call Eretz Yisrael or Shtei Gedotei Yarden. Jordan is part of Palestine historically. Jordanians are citizens, Palestinians are citizens of Jordan. They play a role there. They've always played a role there. The prime minister of Jordan, Safadi. What's Safadi? Tzfat in Hebrew. Safed, meaning his family comes from Tzfat. Safed. So the prime minister of Jordan, after all, he's a Palestinian, and no less occupying a very senior position in the Jordanian regime. So once Jordan is not
almost
Palestine,
done, Mordechai, soon.
excuse me?
Sorry. We're running out of time, just keep it in mind.
Okay, so that's the basic reason why Jordan as constituted is not an Israeli asset. Second reason is the cold peace with Jordan. The bilateral relationship between Israel and Jordan, much of which is hidden, some of which is known, suggests that Jordan has a certain ability to play with political theatrics, conveying the idea that the peace is important, maybe the relationship with Israel is important, conducting talks with the Israelis, Israeli senior officials visiting Amman, speaking with King Abdullah, he never coming to Israel for all intents and purposes. He has the upper hand in what is a cold peace, which is not a people-to-people peace. It's maybe a regime or government-to-government peace, military-to-military peace, but certainly not a warm peace. And the issues which have been part of the tension in the relationship could be mentioned in detail, but because of the short time I have available, we'll leave it at that. But the cold peace. Then there's the diplomatic, international diplomatic arena where King Abdullah, as his predecessor, his father, basically goes around the world and defames Israel. Israel is oppressing the Palestinians. Israel is not observing international norms of being willing to withdraw from all the territories and so on. Or, of course, portraying Israel in a very terrible, dark light regarding the Aqsa events, Al-Aqsa Mosque events of recent days. So on the diplomatic international stage, with his inimitable fashion, I think Abdallah, which he learned from his father, as to how to adopt a certain posture and pose and language and look, all of which is conveyed to an audience which is oblivious to what's going on and oblivious to the art of deception. And so here we have Jordan playing a very negative role from Israel's point of view on the international stage. The last point why Jordan is a problem for Israel, and that is that were Jordan to become more or less a Palestinian state entity, then the natural migration flow of Palestinians from the west side of the river to the east side of the river would be accelerated. If indeed, as Mudal suggested, there would be a Palestinian state in Jordan, it would be a Palestinian state for all Palestinians, wherever they are. They all could acquire citizenship if they don't have it. Well, that kind of situation, and no less the building up of the economy of Jordan
Mordechai.
would attract, just one word, would attract a larger number of Palestinians choosing to migrate to the East Bank of Jordan as a Palestinian state. Today's the 15th of May, what is the Gregorian date for Israel's founding, and what is for the Palestinians the Nakba, the tragedy of their fate in 1948. There was a Nakba in 1948, there may be another one in the future, in which case the Palestinian state would play an important role in attracting those fleeing Israel into the area east of the river.
Thank you very much.